To check out all our products, go to musicnomadcare.com.
Again, with a locking nut, you can't file the individual string slots to correct action problems. You have to either take material off the bottom of the nut to lower it, or you put shims under the nut to raise it, very similarly to the saddle shims. So I'm going to measure all the nut heights using my nut height gauge, and then I'll make the determination, do I need to raise, lower, or am I in good shape? To measure the height of the string above the first fret, which is the nut height, I will use my nut height gauge. This is a feeler gauge set that ranges from 22 thousandths down to 12 thousandths of an inch in 2 thousandths of an inch increments. Each gauge is marked with the type of guitar or type of instrument and the string that it's to be used for. This gauge uses the same type of touch rule as the truss rod gauge. I will put the gauge between the string and the first fret. If I put the gauge between the string and the fret and there's a heavy touch, I will know that my nut slot is too low, and I might need to either shim the nut, make a new nut, or fill that nut slot if the open string is buzzing. If I put the gauge between the string and the first fret and there is no touch and there's a gap between the string and the gauge, I will know that I need to lower that nut slot by filing it, or in the case of this nut, taking material off of the nut. So with the instrument back in the playing position, I'll take my 20 thousandths gauge, again marked low E and A for guitar, and I'm going to put it between the first fret and the low E string. And what I'm looking for is it moving the string? Is there a gap? And what I have is it's almost an exact fit. I mean, it barely rubs the string. So that is an appropriate nut height for the low E string. The next one is my A string. So I'll go ahead and slide the gauge under the E string, and I'm going to raise it up a little bit to keep the end of it flat to the fret. Then I'm going to come in under the A string and see if it's moving the string or if I have a gap. And it's just barely moving the string. So that's a very light touch, which is an appropriate nut height. The one thing that is unique about the locking nut is you may not be able to make every string perfect because you can't adjust the individual nut heights. You have to get the nut kind of overall correct, and you may have a string that's a little high or a string that's a little low. As long as nothing's buzzing, you're fine, but you won't be able to adjust each individual string height like you can on a nut that you can file. But I want to go ahead and get a picture of where my heights are to determine, do I need to lower or raise the nut overall. So I'm going to move over to my 18 thousandths gauge, and I'm going to measure my D and G strings. So same thing with for the D, I'm going to slide it under the E and the A, and I'm going to slide under the D, and I've got just a tiny little bit of space, maybe a thousandth or two, nothing really to worry about. We'll see how the rest of the slots are and determine if we need to do anything about that. So now for the G, I'm going to come in from the high E side. So I'll go under the E and the B string, and I'll put this under the G. And I've got a gap between the G and the gauge. So it's a little high, but I don't know where my E and B are yet. So let's move over to those. So on my B string, it's a little bit high, and my high E is also just a little bit high. It's not major, but it is a little high. If I could lower it down some, I would like to. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to loosen all the strings, and I'm going to unscrew the nut from the neck, and I'm going to see if there are any shims underneath. If there's a thin shim under the treble side, I'm going to take that out, and that will lower the treble side down a little bit. Now again, I can't adjust every string individually, so I'm just going to try to bring that high E side down a little bit, and that will make those slots appropriate. And actually the nut's pretty even across, so I think that all my heights will be good. But let me go ahead and loosen the strings and take this nut off, and we'll see if we have a shim under there. So to loosen the strings on this so that I can pull the nut off, I want to block my tremolo up. If you don't do that, the tremolo falls all the way down in the body. Sometimes as you're loosening strings, the high strings will actually break because as the tremolo is going backwards, it puts a lot of tension on the strings. So what I'll do is I'll get a couple of tongue depressors, just happen to have these laying around, and I'll wrap them in a bit of cloth. You know, you can also use, if you have some cork, if you have a smaller piece of wood, you can, you know, use that. You can, anything that's padded to put under the back of the tremolo will work. But I'm going to raise the trem up a little bit and just stick this under the end of the tremolo, and that keeps it from falling backwards as I loosen the strings. So I've got my tremolo blocked, and I'm going to loosen all 6 strings until they are floppy. Now all my tension is off of the system. I'm going to take off my nut locks so that I can access the 2 screws in the top of the tremolo. On locking tremolo nuts, sometimes they have the 2 screws growing through the top. Sometimes they have screws in the back of the neck, so you would have to just act accordingly. The screws on the back of the neck are usually a 2.5mm Allen wrench. If the screws are through the top, they are usually a Phillips head screwdriver. All right, so I have my strings loosened. I'm going to go ahead and remove the nut by taking out these 2 screws. All right, so out we come. And there is a shim, a small shim under the treble side, which is handy. Sometimes they don't have any shims, and if that's the case, you either need to sand the bottom of the nut down, or you need to take material off of the nut shelf. So if you don't have a belt sander or some way to do that, you know, lowering the nut, if it doesn't have shims, is probably left to your local luthier. We do have a shim underneath. This looks like just kind of a little hand-cut piece of stainless. The typical locking nut shim is this shape, and you can cut it on the screw recesses if you only need a small piece for one end or the other. So if you find that your nut is too low and you are having buzzing issues on any of the open strings, you can order a set of locking nut shims from, you know, any of the typical luthiery supply houses. If you need to raise the entire shim, you would use the shim full width. If you only need to raise one side or the other, you can cut it and you can just use it on either the treble or bass side. So now that I've taken out that shim, I'm just going to go ahead and put my nut back in to the slot. Screw it back down. So just to recap, I had a high, my B string and my E string were a little bit high, so I wanted to lower them, so I pulled the nut out of the slot to see if there was a shim anywhere under the nut so that I could lower the nut by removing the shim. The shim is used to actually lift the nut up out of the slot to raise the strings above the first fret. So if you find that your strings are all too high with a locking nut, the first step is pull the nut off and see if there is a shim, or there could be many shims underneath the nut that you could remove to lower the nut down. So with that shim removed, to lower my high E string, I'm going to screw this nut back into the neck. And these sometimes have a little bit of play side to side, so just make sure that it's centered. The screws do a pretty good job of centering it, but sometimes they'll push to one side of the neck or the other, so you just want to make sure that your nut is centered in the nut slot. Those are snugged up. So now back to pitch. Now when you get it to pitch with the trem blocked like that, when you take out your block, the pitch of the strings is going to change a little bit. So I'm not going to worry too much about getting this perfect right now. but I will get it pretty close. Then I'll take out my block and retune. Okay, so now the trem is floating again. Yes, it's very high. So I'll tune back to pitch now. With a Floyd, there's always some back and forth as you're trying to get it back into tune. The springs are pulling the trem back, the strings are pulling it up, and if all your strings are a little bit sharp, as you tune down, the trem keeps going back and keeps pulling everything sharp again. So there's just a little bit of back and forth getting it all back into tune. But the guitar's back to pitch. I've removed a shim from the treble side of the nut due to the high E being a little bit high. So now I'm going to put the guitar back in the playing position and remeasure my high E. And if it's in spec, I'm going to go ahead and just double check my other measurements and hopefully be in good shape. So I've got my 16 thou gauge. I'm going to come in on the treble side just below the string. Oh yeah, that's better. That's it's just moving the string ever so slightly, but not enough that I would call it a heavy touch on the gauge. So now we've got our high E string in spec. And just so you know, if the string is a little bit lower than the gauge, as long as it doesn't buzz open, it's fine. If the nut heights are a little below spec, but the open string doesn't buzz, don't worry about it. We built in a little bit of a safety margin on the measurements, so if you go a little low, it shouldn't be an issue. So now I'm going to go ahead and measure the rest of my strings, make sure nothing dropped too far from removing that shim. Yeah, now the B is touching just a little bit, but definitely not too much. Move over to my G. As I get closer to the low E, it should just be exactly where it was since I didn't do anything on that side. Yep, my G's good. Measure my D. Yep, just right where it was, right on spec on that 18. Last but not least, my A looks great. And just barely moving that low E string. So for a locking nut, that's about as good as you're going to hope for.
For more videos on how to perform guitar setups or care for your frets, subscribe to our channel and visit MusicNomadCare.com for all our products and how-to videos.